So, Dr. Sandler,
Sir.
you can cure depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
I want
You're
your
probably down a couple samples. I just gave a little talk about what I'm also a counselor.
Welcome to Psychobabble. We have been talking here about conflicts that people have to face in their lives. We've talked about a client who was having this irrational anger at her fiance. We talk about clients who have who keep going from one bad relationship into another. We've talked about difficult emotions and grief, a lot about anger.
Yeah.
And last time we were talking about this difficulty some clients have in expressing their anger at their loved ones because of the feeling of guilt. So we thought that it might be good to have a session devoted to guilt, which is a complicated emotion, and how does it arise and how do we deal with it. So why don't you?
Yeah. And I think the first point we need to make clear is that guilt is a normal part of our emotional repertoire. I have a friend out in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, Jaco Shapiro, is a wonderful psychiatrist. And he was talking to his psychiatry residents about guilt one day, about emotions in general. And he said every emotion has a purpose. If you have fear, Mother Nature's getting you ready to run from danger. If you experience anger, Mother Nature wants you to set your boundaries and protect yourself. And one of the residents said, but not every emotion has a purpose. Look at guilt. What's the good of guilt?
Yeah.
And Jacob answered the question with the question. He said, what do you call a person who never feels guilt? And the resident says, oh, right, that would be a psychopath. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So a little bit of normal guilt, conscience is important. If I offend you in a conversation, I might walk away and think, gosh, I said something really blunt and hurtful. I got to go say I'm sorry, and lunch is on me, and fix that little rupture that happens inevitably in close relationships, in friendships, and marriages. So guilt does have a purpose. It's to fix these relationships and behave properly and not do horrible things.
Yeah.
People don't have quite enough guilt, I'm afraid. But what we want to talk about today is people who have too much guilt. It's irrational guilt. It doesn't make sense. It's a crushing, burdensome guilt, and they can't get rid of it. They can't just go to a friend and say, hey, I'm really sorry, and the friend says, it's okay, let it go, it's fine. They have this terrible guilt. One common scenario I've seen is the child who begins to take care of parents because the parents are not functioning well. It's
a grown-up child, or
a child.
A child.
A 5-year-old or an 8-year-old child.
That some people call that parentified child.
Yes,
okay.
Parentified child in the psychology literature, family therapy literature.
Yeah.
So a fellow I treated said his parents were heavy drinkers. And at age 7 or 8, he hears a teacher talk about alcoholism in school. And he said, oh my God, that's what's wrong with my parents. So he goes and in the early morning on Sunday morning, he sees the rest of the whiskey bottle that they did not drink on Saturday night, and he starts pouring it down the sink. He's trying to stop them from drinking. And he said he tried and tried and tried. In the end, he gets into his late 20s, and his father dies of complications of alcohol abuse. And he comes into therapy, says, I feel so guilty, I didn't visit my father enough in the hospital. But that's the tip of the iceberg. The real guilt is, as we go through therapy, he discovers this thought, like, it was my job to save them, especially my father, who was the heavier drinker, and I failed. I didn't do it. He wasn't doing it, it was my job. That's the kind of irrational guilt that some people bring to the table.
So guilt has a moral connotation. It's one of the emotions that keeps us on the right thing to do. So it's the automatic assessment whether you are doing the right or the wrong. And often you start saying right to wrong and wrong to right. That's where the irrational guilt comes in. Right. So what did you do with this client?
There are a number of things you can do. And of course, sometimes it's not quite so dramatic. I've had patients who say my mother was depressed, and I tried to help her feel better, and she stayed depressed over the years, and I failed in my job. You know, there's no big drama, there's no alcoholism, it's not like the mother was trying to commit suicide, she's just really unhappy, and one of the children in the family knows this, and carries the guilt. There are a number of things you can do. The fellow who's pouring the whiskey down the drain, you can say to him, well, first of all, what does not work is to say, well, you know, that's silly. You're a child. He already knows that. His frontal lobe said, he says it right out loud. He says, I know that as an 8-year-old child I couldn't save them, but that's not the way it feels. That's a line from a Jim Croce song from years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I forget the title of the song, but the refrain is, but that's not the way it feels. What the patient is saying is that my frontal lobe knows that an 8-year-old child can't stop alcoholic parents from drinking. But deep in my brain, there's an amygdala and other emotional areas, and they have a different message for me. They say, you failed. You tried, and you should have tried harder, and then you could have prevented all this.
Yeah.
So just telling him, well, you know, that's silly. He knows it's silly.
Yeah.
He knows it's irrational. There are a number of techniques we can use.
No, just as you can say to me,
Yeah.
because sometimes it is the irrationality is unconsciously built in by the parents. So someone like you know, who grew up with alcoholic parents, you know, they start giving the child the role.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh yeah.
Can you do this for me? Can you check this? Can you, you know, and you know, sometimes trying the kid to mediate, a 5-year-old to mediate between the two, and they're fighting at each other. You know?
Yes.
So the kid gets automatically this role, and so that's where the sense of responsibility comes
Absolutely.
in, and that's where the guilt comes in. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just to go off on a bit of a tangent, some of these children are drawn into the role. Daddy says, "Come, make me a cup of coffee. You know, Daddy's not feeling well after last night," and they just draw the child in. Some of these kids, I think, are born with an enormous capacity for compassion and empathy. They're like, they have a gift. They just have a gift for this, and you can tell in therapy the way they talk about other people. And sometimes I feel like it's a privilege to sit with these people. There's a great shortage of
Mother Teresa or something.
I was going to say they're like little Mother Teresas.
It just comes from inside, yeah.
Yeah, they're born with it. And I've met children, not just adults, who describe that in retrospect. I've met children, and you can see it in a young child. They're so compassionate. And we're living in an age where there's a shortage of compassion, I'm afraid.
Yes.
But,
yeah. That's a different discussion.
That's a different discussion, which we won't get into because it gets into politics and the way people talk to each other in political races is so terrible, crazy, you know. But these kids are so gifted, and it occurs to me that we have nothing in our educational system to support their gift. We're looking for kids who are good in science and math all the time. I think science and math are great. But it's like saying to a young Mozart, all right, look, Wolfgang, you spend enough time practicing piano. We want you to practice your times tables.
Yeah.
So we say to these gifted little Mother Teresas, you know, you need to work on your spelling words. There's a quiz coming up on Friday. What we don't do is send them to a high school counselor that says, you have a gift for compassion, and we want you to tutor some of the younger kids. And here's some careers that you might excel at, like the helping professions.
Yes.
I'm off on a tangent, but it troubles me that we don't recognize these kids and we don't guide them.
Yeah, yeah.
They could make.
I think in general, in the education system, there should be some kind of a curriculum built in about psychological issues. You know,
yes.
How to resolve conflicts, how to manage anger, how to manage sadness,
Absolutely.
and, you know, those kind of things.
Emotional intelligence.
Emotional intelligence, which is completely lacking, and you're on your own, and if you're lucky, you have good parents who can teach you that. You know, because often the parents, they don't know too, but they were never taught.
Right.
Yeah.
It should be.
But coming back to the caregivers, one of the things that that later on plagues them at times is that they adopt this caregiver role.
Yeah.
that becomes their identity.
Yes.
And then they can be exploited because of that.
That is true.
So wherever they are, they are the ones who will intervene, and they will solve the problem, and they will carry the burden of the family. And
Yes.
people keep just burdening them
Yes.
and burdening them because they are taking it.
Right.
And they come to a point where they break down and they say that I can't do it anymore.
Right.
But they cannot say that, because if they say that, they'll feel guilty
Right.
of abandoning their role.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you send these kids to college,
Yeah.
they attract all the most
Yes.
troubled, upset kids in college, the ones
Yes.
who are threatening suicide, and they're on the phone at 3 a.m. talking kids
Yes.
off
Yes.
the wall,
Yes. Yeah.
So they have this gift, but it can become a burden.
Yes.
But getting back to psychotherapy, so this young man sitting in front of me says, at age 8, I was pouring the whiskey down the drain. So there's a number of things we can do, including, can you picture that little boy pouring the whiskey? And what would you say to him? And he says something like, you don't have to do that, it's not your job. But he says it now, he's full of affect.
Right.
Because I'm using his compassion in the therapy and directing it toward himself,
That's great. Yeah.
not the parents.
Mhm.
So he suddenly has compassion for the child.
Mhm.
You don't have to do that, that's not your job, you can't do that.
So you're developing self-compassion.
Yes,
Is what people
yes,
say,
which
right?
is what many of these people don't
Right.
allow much.
Right.
Their compassion is all outer directed.
Mhm.
So, but the minute he does that, of course, he's faced with this horrible reality that says, I couldn't help, it was up to my parents, and they were so impaired that they never went to an AA meeting, they never tried to get help, they didn't act like adults.
Mhm.
And then there's a lot of grief, sometimes anger over that.
Mhm.
Because in a sense, this omnipotent fantasy, like I am an 8-year-old child and I'm going to cure my father's alcoholism, it serves as a gigantic defense against the painful reality. My father is so far gone, nothing's going to help him. And I grew up in this helpless mess.
Yeah.
So that's just one of many
Yeah.
techniques you can use
Yes.
to help somebody like that.
Yeah, very good. So this is one form of the guilt that people face in their lives, and we deal with in the therapy session, and we can talk about more.
Yeah.
But this one, if we can put a label on it, would be that feeling bad because you are good.
I like that. Feeling bad because you're good.
Yeah.
In a funny way, the compassion and the guilt go together like a train and a caboose.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
These people are so kind and so compassionate,
Yeah.
but they wind up feeling guilty for the family problem.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's another common scenario, of course, which is that the guilt is a boomerang kind of an anger. That a kid grows up with a father who says, you messed up again, you never do anything right, you never do anything good around the house, and just hammers at the kid for whatever reasons the father has. And that kid grows up with a lot of anger, but turns it on himself. In a sense, to spare the father, or to avoid conflict with the father who is overpowering.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for him, the solution is he's got to start to give voice to the anger at his father. Picking a father, it could be a mother or a grandfather. He's got to voice the anger against his father and let it out, and we have to somehow make a space for that and say it's okay to feel this rage against your father. Here we get into our previous discussions, what if you grew up with this thou shalt not dishonor thy parents kind of a mentality. But if he can begin to face the anger at his father, then he finds he's not beating himself up as much. And some of these people suffer terribly from this.
Yeah. But do you think that expressing that, getting in touch with that feeling and expressing it and accepting it is enough to make that characterological change in which they kind of save themselves from being the caregivers, because that has become their identity. What I see is that they don't want to give it up.
It can, yeah.
Because that's who they are.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
but they can still be caring for people, but in a healthier way.
In a healthier way, yeah.
Right, not caring for people who can't be saved,
Yeah. So they can then learn to set boundaries and say no,
Right.
Yeah.
And this fellow I'm talking about with the critical father, he was not a caretaker. He was just an angry guy who kept turning the anger on himself. And some of these people are very self-defeating, with the father in mind.
Yes.
They're hearing you'll never amount to anything, and they don't let themselves amount to much.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to get this anger out so they can say, this is about my father. There was nothing wrong with me, and I have a right to succeed in life.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
At the extreme, of course, there are people who have this unconscious guilt and feel like they've done something terrible. I've had a number of patients who say, I consciously remember wishing my father or mother would die. I'm conscious because they were abused and mistreated. And in my book, Tea with Freud, the chapter about Tom, a couple chapters about this fellow Tom, were all about that. He had the terrible experience of an abusive dad, and said to a schoolmate, I hate my father, I wish he would die. And the father died shortly thereafter, just fell over of a heart attack and was gone. So we can imagine the guilt that in his child's mind, he killed his father.
Yeah.
And that took a lot of work to get him through that.
Mm-hmm.
But for some people, it's just, I had that wish, and the father didn't die, but they still feel like they did it.
Mm-hmm.
They committed some terrible crime in their mind with that wish.
Good. I think we've covered a little bit, a good intro to the subject.
Yeah, it's a big subject,
It's a
guilt,
big
right?
subject, but we can take a break here and continue it on maybe next time.
I would love to, yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, see you next time.
See you next time.
I want to get home.